Hi everyone. As many of you probably know, I'm Steve Smedley, Associate Director here at Acuity. I'm also joined today by Nitin Palmer and James Edmondson from Acuity. So we'll be hosting today's workshop. And this is part of a two-episode effort at improving data quality. So just this time, it's a quick canter through the financial and regulatory metrics. We won't be able to deal with absolutely everything that you want to know. We have got really comprehensive definitions for this on the website that are available on your data entry pages, and I'd really encourage you to check those definitions, because this workshop won't actually be a substitute for really getting to grips with those definitions. So just a bit of housekeeping before I crack on. As I say, this is all about helping you get your data collection right. It should last an hour. We might overshoot a little bit depending on the kind of questions we get. If you've got any technical issues getting your sound right or posting questions, just get in touch with James there by using the chat function on the bottom toolbar. I'll also be pausing at appropriate places in the presentation, and I'll be taking any questions we've got so far. And if you could use also the little function on the toolbar at the bottom, the Q&A function, what I'll do is I'll kind of flick that open when I pause, and I'll systematically go through as many questions as I possibly can. The other thing I should say is we are recording this, so if there's anything that you need to come back to, it will be available shortly after we've finished. It'll be available on our website, as will these my presentation slides, which include hypertext links to useful documents. So all that will be available, plus anything else we decide to stick on the website, depending on how the questions go. So that's that. Without further ado, I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. So hopefully everybody can see that. As you know, we're going to be looking at your financial and regulatory metrics. What I'm going to do is just very briefly just revisit some benchmarking basics. I'm not going to completely rehearse everything that I did last week, but I'm aware that a number of you won't have been on last week, so I am going to just touch on it. I'm then going to have a look at some of the sector metrics we've got and how they all relate within the context of VFM. I'm then going to look at our 4 key Acuity cost metrics that complement the regulatory headline cost metric. Basically, I see these 4 Acuity metrics as a way of you digging deeper into the regulatory headline cost metric. And the point of that is when the regulator came up with that headline metric, the whole point of it was to get you to unpack that metric, explore it, and talk about cost drivers in the context of what you're trying to do as an organization. So that's why I've got these 4 key Acuity cost metrics in there, because they actually help you tell that story, break that story down in a convincing evidence-based way. Then I'm going to briefly just touch on the regulatory metrics and basically point you in the right direction to ensure that you get those regulatory metrics right. As we're talking about benchmarking definitions, do put away any sharp objects now. So a little bit about benchmarking basics. Again, benchmarking is the start of the journey. It is not the last word. Benchmarking metrics can be used sometimes in the sector, sometimes by politicians, sometimes by cheap point scoring journalists, etc., to beat the social housing sector. That was never their intention. And don't do it to yourself just by presenting benchmarking data just as a little table with no commentary. Benchmarking data is a business analysis tool. It's there as a starting point to explore variation about why metrics are what they are. Why have you got a degree of variation between you and others? And the point is that should start you off on a process of trying to understand what's driving those costs, some of which will be entirely contextual, such as the extent of your service offer and client group, for instance, but some of it may be to do with lackluster performance. But that's for you to unpack by working as a team, as an executive team, working with your staff, working with the board to try and unpack what's going on there. So basically, it's a business analysis tool that once you've done that kind of analysis will enable you to make evidence-based resource allocation decisions, i.e. decide how you're going to split up finite resources across, if you like, the most important activities that you undertake. It also will enable you to understand what good looks like and what bad looks like, and perhaps direct focused improvement work. By having sectoral medians and the interquartile position, understanding, for instance, what top quartile performance looks like, enables you to set targets, ambitious targets, to essentially achieve really good performance by being a good performer as well, by having good, solid social housing management performance combined with reducing your costs in a managed way so it doesn't affect that performance, creates capacity, and basically in a risky operating environment, having a little bit of capacity cost-wise, it's nice to have it in the bank, as it were, because it creates headroom, or it creates a buffer. It's also got a completely other use, benchmarking data. In addition to being a business analysis tool, it enables you to be transparent with your stakeholders. And that includes be transparent with your board, or be even transparent within the executive team if you've got a decent suite of data, but also be transparent outside the organisation. And clearly the white paper is very clear about being transparent, particularly with tenants, about how well you're performing. And the whole point about transparency is the mother of accountability. The only reason you're being transparent is so that people can hold you to account. What does all of this do? It provides assurance to those around you that you've got a sound grasp of cost and performance in context. And all of that is actually a VFM regulatory requirement as well. So benchmarking is not the last word. It is not just a hatful of metrics that somebody glances at and says, yeah, these people are rubbish and these people are good. That's not what it is. It's not like a computer says no binary kind of result. As much as we love metrics at Acuity, there are limitations with metrics. And basically the data means nothing without the story of why the metrics are what they are. And especially with these financial metrics, they're often as much, if not more, about context as they are about performance. So something like margin, a good margin, that if you were trying to pick stocks and shares, you'd be looking at an organization's margin, and then you'd be looking at a really good margin as being evidence of a very efficient company, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that only works so far as the social housing sector is concerned, because a really good margin could just mean that you're providing a very vanilla, simple, happy shopper type service for general needs tenants, that you're not really investing in your services at all, and you're not really trying that hard. On the other side of things, a poorer margin might be because you've invested massively in the service and in updating your stock. It might just mean that you're a supported or a HFOP provider, housing for older people, because we know that their margins tend to be lower. So my point quite simply is, context is absolutely key here. Also, metrics need to be looked at in the round, complemented with other info. So that's all kinds of tenant feedback. So you can never just rely on the benchmarking data. You need to kind of consider, what kind of feedback have you had from tenants? What kind of complaints have you had? Have you done any service reviews? What's tenant scrutiny saying? So all of this needs to be looked at in the round. So over many years, as far as VFM is concerned, if you're trying to make a judgment about how well you're doing at VFM, it isn't exclusively based on a suite of benchmarking metrics. I think it's a very human, nuanced, qualitative assessment. And it's taken in the context of your mission and your prevailing operating environment and the circumstances you find yourself in. And it is very much about taking a whole body of evidence in the round where benchmarking data is only part of it. So it is definitely not a finely calibrated tool for saying, oh, we are 7th out of 25 organizations. It's not that finely calibrated. So it really doesn't make for league tabling. It's good for ballpark, understanding a ballpark sense of where you are compared to your peers. But so, i.e. top quartile, second quartile, that kind of stuff, not good for kind of saying we're specifically here. Do not get hung up on minor apportionment issues of how much cost these paper clips should go in this pot or the other pot. With benchmarking, we're only interested in material stuff, not minor issues. And unfortunately, sometimes it's used to beat people. It really isn't. That's not what benchmarking is about. Benchmarking is a constructive tool for helping you understand, as I say, an analytical tool to help you understand what's going on so you can make things better as a team. So all the definitions are available on the data entry page by clicking on the little blue question mark. So here's a typical data entry page. At the top of it, there's a little blue question mark there. You will get chapter and verse by clicking on that for any given definition. This one, for instance, is just percentage of rent loss, it's void loss, and you would get chapter and verse on that, as you would for all the rest of the definitions. Data quality is a hot issue, has been for the last 2 years with the regulator. Excuse me. Data quality is only going to go up the agenda as the white paper unravels, as it were. You really, because we're benchmarking, you've committed to essentially conform to the definitions that we've got here. And you need to be astute to the fact that sometimes our definitions might differ very slightly to how you've traditionally counted something. So you just need to make sure that you're definitely entering data for, say, in this case, void loss. You may have calculated that a certain way in your organization, and it works for you, and there's nothing wrong with it. But if you're benchmarking here, if you want to compare like with like, you have to stick to the definition that's lurking behind that little blue question mark. Definitions can't legislate for everything. It's like law, really. You can't legislate just for everything. So sometimes something needs interpreting, often, always interpreted on the basis for which that definition exists. What is that definition trying to do? Again, like law, what is it trying to do? Therefore, how should we interpret this specific quirky little issue that we've come up with? If you've got any issues, you just call us. We'll help you solve that definition conundrum once you've had a little look at the blue question mark. But also our clubs are really useful forums to actually discuss these thorny issues, and often we do, and often our clubs actually help us create brand new benchmarking definitions. Any definitions that we amend, we also cross-check with HouseMark, because we want to ensure consistency between us and them. When you do submit your benchmarking data at the end of the year, just ensure that your profile tab is up to date. You'll find it. You click on your data entry. You put your data. You click on PI data to enter your metrics data, but you click on the HA profile to put your profile data. This is really useful because it enables you to, when you want to benchmark and you're trying to pick a bespoke peer group, the kind of information that is in HA profile will help you narrow down the field, because it's got data in there like the split between general needs supported, housing for older people, stock number. So it enables you to find, for instance, an organisation that has a similar stock size to you, as well as a similar, say, mix of GN supported and HFOP. It also has turnover levels, again, and staffing levels, all of which enable you to find the right sized or profiled organisation. Right, so without further ado, I'm going to crack on, tell you about sector metrics. It's a bit busy, this, but I can explain. So if we look up here, these are the regulatory metrics. The value for money standard requires you to collect. So as we all know, the centerpiece for some time for the regulator has been their 7 mandatory metrics. By that we mean the social housing headline metric, the return on capital employed, those kinds of metrics, the margin, etc., etc. You know, the EBITDA. So that's them. You have to put those in your financial accounts every year. Otherwise, you're non-compliant. Simple as that. The other thing that the VFM standard requires you to do is put in your own strategic targets. Now, you exist for a social purpose. What the regulator's trying to get you to do here is dream up some metrics, if they don't already exist in your corporate dashboard, that say something about how well you're achieving your mission. So with a lot of organizations, for instance, they want to provide great landlord services, etc. So it stands to reason that perhaps you might have a couple of metrics, or one metric at least, that says something about how good your services are. For instance, overall satisfaction with service. So the point is, for the avoidance of doubt here, that you are expected from the VFM standard to have metrics that map to what you are trying to achieve in terms of your strategic corporate objectives, right? All of those get bundled up and reported in your accounts, right? So what the regulator is expecting you to do with this combined bunch of metrics is basically answer the question, why are these metrics what they are? They're asking you to tell a story about these metrics. And by you telling that story, they want you to basically answer the question, is VFM being maximized? To help you tell this story. And what I should say, right, is those of you that do the sector scorecard, it's voluntary. The regulator quite likes you to bundle these metrics in as well, but you don't have to. They're not mandatory at all. If you're doing this, you're doing it on a voluntary basis. And those of you that have followed the regulatory scorecard from inception will know that at the very start, they included all of the regulatory metrics, and there had to be a little bit of horse trading to actually get these metrics to converge. But now if you're doing the sector scorecard, you're doing these regulatory metrics as part of it as well. But as I say, the ones that aren't overlapping, the sector scorecard metrics that aren't overlapping with the regulatory ones, those, it's entirely voluntary. It's up to you whether you include those in your VFM reporting. You don't have to do them at all, but you do have to do these ones. So the point about these headline metrics and these ones, if you're shoving them in your VFM reporting as well, is to tell a story about why these metrics are as they are, and you tell that story in the context of what you're trying to achieve as an organization. So where we see Acuity, and if you do HouseMark as well, where we see Acuity and HouseMark metrics fitting in this story, is there additional metrics? Obviously, you collect all these with Acuity anyway, so they are Acuity metrics in that sense. But those of you that have, as you know, we provide an annual report for you every year with a whole bunch of other metrics in. They are all part and parcel of you unpacking these headline metrics and telling a story about the VFM that you're achieving at your organization. So as you go through the process of visiting these metrics, expanding on them a little with other Acuity metrics, what you're basically doing is you're conveying a story about value and value for money at your organization. So ultimately, going through this kind of process enables you to provide a credible narrative and a course of action in your communication. So whether that's in your accounts to meet the regulatory requirement, or if it's going, into an annual report of some sort, you're able to tell a credible story about why these metrics are what they are and what you're going to do about it. So I mentioned very briefly there, and this is a slight digression, but it's important because I know that a lot of the sector is still not getting this and probably not regulatory compliant as a result of it. I mentioned that part of the mandatory expectation up here was that you provide your own strategic targets. And I talked that basically you need to come up with metrics that basically map to your mission, map to what you're trying to achieve as an organization. And I would argue in my 30 years in being in social housing that I have yet to come across any organization that you can't break their mission, their social mission down to being in one of 4 of these. If you do any non-social activity, I would argue that non-social activity simply exists to perhaps get some extra pocket money that actually contributes to one of these items. So any social housing organization is trying to ensure that their tenants get good landlord services. Those of you that are developers are trying to stick up new homes that meet a range of need. And of course, any new home basically has social good, but if it's a social housing tenancy, it has a lot of social good. Most of you are involved in some shape or form, investing in your communities to make those communities work. It's about people, place, and planet. And of course, those of you that work in HFOP and other support, you're putting in a lot of extra effort to support dignity and independence. I don't think there's anything that doesn't fall in there. Now, any organisation that exists to do these items worth its salt should be able to measure its success, measure how well it's doing at delivering this kind of stuff. So all the regulators expecting you to do, basically, if you haven't already done it, and it's not lurking in your corporate dashboard, is come up with metrics that actually show how you're achieving across these four. And here, it's simply a case of, how much money are you able to recycle into these four items. So I've just given you a few ideas on this side of what kind of metrics might be there. But this is, if you haven't already done this exercise, this is for the exec team, perhaps, or working with perhaps the board as well, to absolutely nail some success measures for your organization. Once you know what those metrics are, then you set a target against it. So the first thing you have to develop is a metric that maps to whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. Then you set a target against it. So that's all I want to say on that, because that was a digression, but an important one. So how do the various cost metrics relate? Well, the centerpiece for the cost metrics is the regulator's headline social housing cost metric, which, as you should know, breaks down into key components that you'll find in any generic accounts, particularly those organizations that complete an FVA. And I know a lot of small organizations don't do an FVA, and I'm going to come to that soon. But these are the major components. The way that they map, I'll just set out rough mapping of how accounts-based metrics might map to our four key cost metrics. Our four key cost metrics look like this. We've got one on housing management, one on responsive repairs and voids works, one on major works and cyclical. Those two are together because they both constitute planned work. And then we've got something that hoovers up all the overheads for the organization. These should account pretty much for most of your costs. And there is most of the standard, bog standard, universal social housing costs. There's a number of costs that we exclude because they'd queer the pitch, because they would unlevel the playing field. I'm going to come to that in a second. And then for those of you that are interested in our further breakdown into repairs that we do from the management accounts, in a way, they're drilling further into these three metrics here. So that's how they sit. So the point is with accounts-based metrics, it's a bit of a mess, because the point is all of these metrics here were devised with benchmarking in mind. These metrics weren't devised with benchmarking in mind at all. They are simply lines in the accounts, and they're fine for the accounts. No problem for accounts. But when you start to try and benchmark, say, the management component of this, the service charge, the maintenance component, major repairs, etc., at a high level, they become decidedly flaky because they are not defined within an inch of their lives. These are defined within an inch of their lives. You can compare them. These components get very, very flaky. Here's one of the reasons. Where, from organization to organization, they can decide where overheads go. We have one pot that deals with all overheads. Here, an organization could decide that they're going to have overheads associated with management, all lumped in with management. If they didn't fancy doing that, they could decide that the overheads are all going to go in other or somewhere else. And there's it's up to the organisation how it's going to treat overheads completely. Not only that, to make matters more confusing, I've said the bit about overheads can go where they like. If an organisation wanted to have really high management costs and it wanted to lose it, it could decide, and this is like gaming the system, it's quite a negative thing to do. It could decide to assign quite a generous amount of overheads, if you like, to other. So it could just decide, because there's nothing governing what is overheads, it could just pluck up a figure that it's saying is an overhead component of management, and just decide to hide it away in other, to bring down the management cost. Similarly, where would an organisation put, if you like, the client side of maintenance, the office side of maintenance? You know, again, that's up to the organisation. It might actually say, well, actually, the client side of maintenance is kind of like a management function, so we're going to stick it in management. Whereas another organisation might say, actually, client side and contractor side are all in here. Then another organisation might be doing lots of community development work, you know, people and places, making places work. Where's it sticking it? Is it sticking it, keeping it in management, or is it actually squirreling it away in other? So my point with this really messy slide is the regulator's headline metric, when you break it down into its components, is just too flaky to be able to compare to others with confidence. Whereas R1 here, our 4 metrics really help you with some confidence. If you stick to the definitions, will help you break down headline costs. So let's just have a quick, I'm just going to stop sharing for a second just to see if we've got any questions yet. Right, we haven't got any questions yet, and that kind of suits me because I can now just simply crack on with the key Acuity metrics. As I say, as I go through these, I think it's going to start generating questions. So simply use the Q&A function at the bottom of your pages to just post me a question, and I'll hoover them up once I've gone through this lot. So I'm going to crack on. Again, those of you that have joined us late, just a reminder, we are recording this, so it will be available afterwards, as will my slides. So I'm going to crack on with the those 4 Acuity cost metrics. So as I've just said, those accounts-based metrics are somewhat flaky at the component level because they're lacking a method for allocating costs in a consistent way. Yeah, you might have accounting directives, you might have SORP and stuff, but it isn't nailing down the components in the same way that a decent benchmarking definition does. Why did we come up with these cost metrics? Well, we came up with them about 4 or 5 years ago because members identified the need for robust but proportionate cost metrics because they saw which way the wind was blowing with regulation and the need to kind of be able to pick costs apart. But also a number of boards were actually wanting more detailed cost information. As I said, they've got comprehensive definitions. We developed them with HouseMark so that it enables you to compare these 4 definitions. You can directly compare to the bigger associations. I would really commend reading the guidance doc that explains this suite of metrics. So it provides the definition it provides detailed definitions for each of the metrics, but it actually explains in a kind of holistic way how they sit as a suite. It's really worth having a read of it. And that's a hypertext link, so you just need to click on that. My slides will be available, and you'll get chapter and verse. I really don't mean this to look as snotty as it looks on the slide, but if you're going to do these metrics, and I really recommend that you do them as a means of helping you really understand your costs, you need to stick to the definitions. If you don't think you're going to stick to it, I wouldn't do them. So it requires a bit of effort, but once you've gone through that bit of effort initially, you'll know how they work, and doing it subsequently is a lot easier. So just a little bit about the metrics. They are designed to capture the costs associated with the common core business of a social landlord. So that's the common core business. Fancy stuff gets parked in the lay-by, frankly, because everybody's got slightly different business models, and some of you focus, say, on support, etc., etc. So there are certain things, and some of you are developers. So what we've tried to do is the things that vary most in the sector, we've taken them out to level the playing field. So the four metrics are housing management, responsive repairs and void works, major works and cyclical, and overheads expressed as a percentage of turnover. And that last one there, the overheads metric, it's the same one that appears in the sector scorecard if you do it. So as I've said, what they do is they level the playing field because, yes, the main one where the playing field is leveled is housing management. And it's because your business models differ. And they differ by your client group, whether you're HFOP or support. It might differ because you have a particularly extensive service offer or stock type. Oh. That's my coffee arriving. And it really is the housing management one that differs from the other three on this, where we're excluding stuff, because it's in the housing management field where the major differences are identified. So what we're excluding from housing management is anything that you spend on community investment, because you do that more or less depending on your mission. We take out the contractor side of estate services, and that's because some organizations have lots of low and high rise stock, for instance, and they might be employing all kinds of estate-based staff. They might even have a concierge or some kind of caretaking service or something like that. Now, there are loads of organizations that just don't have that kind of accommodation. So we don't want costs. We're looking, as I say, to completely level the playing field by taking the variability out. But the key area of variability on something like this, as you all know, is around care and support. And that includes the support side of housing for older people. So what we basically do is we take out the definition for housing management here is taking out all that intensive extra care and support that you provide as a supported provider or a HFOP provider. We take that out. It's not included in the housing management metric because we're just trying to narrow the definition of housing management into, if you like, bog standard housing management. So by taking those things out, it means that any social housing provider should be able to compare to another one. Even a support provider should be able to compare to a general needs provider because we've taken out all those extra costs. The one caveat here is how the individual organisation differentiates, if you like, between bog standard housing management and, if you like, the more intensive supported housing management. We also take out other serviceable chargeable costs because, again, that's to do with the peculiarity of the service that you're provided, and it's not a bog standard feature. All of these costs that we're whipping out from housing management go into the other pot. And if you like, the other pot is effectively a fifth pot. So with these four metrics, the four killer metrics that we've created, each of them is essentially a pot in which to put your money. There's a fifth invisible pot, if you like, where you stick in all of these non-standard, if you like, non-standard costs are all going in a fifth pot that we're calling other, along with a few other costs. So as I say, all of this just really applies to housing management, and it's about us trying to level the playing field for housing management. These other three metrics, we're not narrowly defining it in the same way. So it simply picks up the costs of you providing the services for responsive repairs, voids work, major works, etc., and picking up your overheads. So that's how the pots look. So housing management, all your costs associated with rent collection and arrears go in there, tenancy management, lettings, ASB, and resident involvement. If you have got any estate services costs on the client side, and by that we mean the management of estate services rather than the actual caretakers, concierge, grounds maintenance type people themselves, it's just the management side that's going in there. Responsive and voids, all your costs go in there on the contractor side and the client side. It is just trying to get the overall quantum of how much you're spending on this function. Similarly, major works and cyclical, we're capturing all the costs, contractor and client. Note also that we're putting your capital spend in there as well. That's what the definition does. Overheads, I've got a bit more of a detailed slide on overheads that I'll come to soon. Is capturing all your back office costs. So we're talking about your anything to do with office premises, your finance function, IT, or whatever it's called these days, and just general central overheads, including HR. For the avoidance of doubt, your CEO is an overhead. That might make some of you feel a bit upset, but that's to equalize things. That's where the CEO goes. So we're not looking at, if you like, apportioning the CEO's time across these three pots. So here's your four pots that correspond to the four metrics. And here's your other pot, which, as I said, that's where your estate services contractor side goes. All your extra effort in support and care, development costs go in there, and community investment, plus stuff like reconciling items like depreciation, and I'll come to a bit more on that in a second. So with the exception of that capital spend that we squirreled away in major works and cyclical, all your costs going into these pots should equal your total operating costs. So I'm saying there should be a reconciliation here with what you put across all of those pots should equal your total operating costs plus capital spend. Yeah, so this is a way of you accounting for absolutely everything. As I've already said, that fifth pot isn't benchmarkable because it's just the place where we've put all those wonderful variation that goes on in the social housing sector. It's simply set aside so that you can benchmark the other thing, the other four pots on a level playing field. Non-paid costs are generally straightforward to allocate from your internal cost structure. Like you can go through your what is it, trial balance, or you know, your raw accounting cost architecture. However you divvy things up, it's fairly easy to look for lines in your cost architecture and drop them into the right pot. Employee costs might be a bit more difficult because many staff at a bigger housing association is quite simple in that most staff fall into one of the 5 pots really easily. Like, you know, repairs staff, you just have staff dedicated to repairs, stick them in the repairs box. That's no problem. But smaller housing associations, you're ranging across activities so that you need to apportion your staff time on the respective activities. And you only need to do this roughly. Do not agonize that, oh, they're spending 18% of their time on housing management, 22% of their time on major works, and, you know, 52%. That's not what we're talking about. It just needs to be, keep things material. Don't dance on the head of a pin. Just roughly apportion their time. Why do we express overheads as a percentage of turnover and not per unit? Well, the answer quite simply is that some of your business models have significant activity that is divorced from the unit numbers managed, but they nevertheless, they have quite an impact on overhead costs. So, for instance, support contracts and extensive community work. So in terms of the 3 cost per property metrics, so that's the housing management, the repairs and voids, and the major works and cyclical, they basically work like this. You take the total direct costs of, say, housing management, the managed stock, because benchmarking, we're interested in managed things largely, divided by the number of units in management. It's a fairly simple calculation. Total direct costs of the activity. By direct, we mean excluding overheads. That's what direct means. It means everything bar overheads. And the reason we're excluding that, obviously, is because we've got a separate metric that's looking at overheads. Total staff costs include all on costs, so NI, pension, and any other on costs. In terms of, it also picks up all your non-pay costs, so you know, your procurement and stuff like that. The definition, again, we can't cover everything in this, but the definitions are comprehensive. They provide an exhaustive list of the types of staff and the types of non-paid costs. So do check out the detailed definitions. As I've said, CEO doesn't appear anywhere other than overheads. Right, so you'll remember from the previous slide that the other part is where we put everything that's non-standard. So sitting in there, as I've said, is your support and care, your contractor side estate services and community investment activity. It also includes various reconciling items. So any one-off hits you take for redundancy or pension deficit funding, they go in the other pot, as do all those things there: loan fees, charges for bad debt, charitable donations, depreciation of housing stock, because you'll remember that your actual capital costs are going in your major works, impairment, cost of sales, etc. And any other kind of one-off costs. So that's the 3 cost per property metrics. In terms of overheads, it works like this: total costs of overheads divided by adjusted turnover multiplied by 100 to get a percentage. What do we mean by total costs? Again, we mean total staff costs of people working in, you know, back office type functions, so NI, pension, and on cost, and we're talking about all non-paid costs. Again, check out the definitions for chapter and and verse on the types of staff we're talking about, but also the kind of non-paid costs that get put in this particular kitty. As we know, the CEO lives here, as does any PA type staff. Any corporate services staff also sit here. Office managers are here and front of house receptionists. But what I'm talking about is a generic front of house receptionist that's just fronting up the whole business. That's distinct from somebody that's just a front of house customer service staff. Now, most of you, I'm thinking, probably won't have just a generic front of house receptionist that, say, somebody that looks a bit more corporate might have. So it might be that you've got none of these front of house receptionists, you've just got front of house customer service staff. Your front of house customer service staff will need to be divvied across the other 3 metrics. But yeah, all of your IT spend, people as well as kit go in this one. Similarly, finance, HR, payroll, performance management, business improvement, PR, marketing, anything to do with governance also lives here. So yeah, other costs that go in here is what you spend on rents or depreciation, because my understanding is depreciation is kind of, if you like, the equivalent of rent in this way, in terms of costing for something that you actually own. Other premises costs like utilities, office supplies, finance costs, recruitment, training, IT, software, yada, 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 all that. The reason we use adjusted turnover, and again, you'll get a full definition of what we mean by adjusted turnover, but it is again about leveling the playing field, because we want to eliminate skewing from it. Stuff like property sales, like a very diversified business, and amortization, which is spelled the American way. Right, I am gonna stop there and deal with the questions. So Indran's saying, bit confused between management costs and overheads. Right, hopefully, Indran, as I've gone through this, because you asked a question a few minutes back, I think probably I've answered this as I've explained the way that they work. All I was saying as far as the regulatory split of the way that the social housing headline metric splits down into management and maintenance and stuff is that quite simply there isn't a heading there called overheads. So it's up to the individual organization where it sticks overheads. All the metrics that I've since gone through, like our cost metrics here, we've got really clearly defined metrics that help you understand what is an overhead and what, in this case, is housing management. If I haven't properly answered that, Indran, get back to me on that. Cassandra is saying, we have staff who deal with both repairs calls and repairs management and housing management, e.g. arrears calls, taking rents. How do we divide these costs? Right. But I think, Cassandra, you feel that I've probably answered it. Yeah, absolutely. My point, and I really want to emphasize this, I don't want you sitting there doing massive time and motion analysis on your staff, because one thing, it really, really upsets them, because the first thing that anybody thinks when you start doing that with them is that, oh, redundancy is just around the corner. So yeah, I wouldn't do that. What I would do is I just have a discussion with your staff. And if you have got any metrics, like if you do have got metrics on what kind of phone calls come in, or some kind of split on the volume of inquiries you get, you can use that in a very easy way to make a rough calculation. It wouldn't surprise me if a lot of your front of staff, if isn't a million miles away from a 50-50 split between repairs and everything else. But you know, depending on exactly what goes on at your organization, you're going to have a better sense that in general, you know, a little bit more than half of your enquiries or calls or contact is about repairs than the other stuff, in which case just skew it slightly in favor of repairs. But as I say, do not lose any sleep on this kind of stuff. There are no more questions at this point, so I'm going to crack on. I hope with those metrics, I have given you quite, I think it's a reasonably comprehensive overview of the principles of these metrics and roughly how they work. As I say, I think use this presentation as a basis now for delving a little bit deeper, following the hypertext link that I've given you here, to actually look at the guidance doc, and you'll see it makes a lot of sense. When I used to work at HouseMark and since I've done work for Acuity, what I've found with organizations is the actual architecture that's set out in these definitions is actually helpful for a number of organizations. And in fact, it's actually influenced the way in which they account for things internally, because there's a certain rationale to looking at things. So I would commend it for you to absolutely nail these. So a little bit about regulatory metrics. There's just a little reminder there in the top right-hand corner. That's what the regulatory metrics, the mandatory metrics look like that you're expected to put into your accounts. As I say, they're supposed to be complemented with your own strategic targets, so don't forget that bit of it. And you're supposed to provide a little bit of a story about those metrics. As I've explained, you're supposed to explain why they are so, and draw in your accompanying, if you like, Acuity metrics to provide a credible kind of evidence-based story. When the regulator came up with these metrics, they reckoned that they represented different facets of the value chain. I think they are a bit limited. The massive yawning gap in this is anything that tells you about the quality of the service and anything about, if you like, the consumer experience. And as you all probably know, we're going to get some early soft consultation from the regulator in the next few months on what those consumer metrics might look like. And then these metrics here won't look so, if you like, unbalanced from a regulatory perspective. The regulator realizes that, you know, it's done the best that it can with these metrics, and that no suite of regulatory metrics can capture everything that matters to tenants. And that's one of the reasons why they want you to put your own metrics in that correspond, if you like, to what you're trying to achieve as an organization, because that does reflect the value of your organization. Without a doubt, some of these metrics will expose certain housing associations as outliers, especially smaller ones. And really, with these finance metrics, as I said very early on, so much of it is about context. So much of it is about the decision that you've taken to invest in your properties and provide really great services, which might actually reduce operating margin. If that's the case, well, you need to be saying that in your narrative, that this is a conscious decision that, yes, we might be below median or in, you know, the lower quartile, but that's because we've made a conscious decision to invest in our properties and also invest in our housing management services. If you're interested in it, the regulator came out with something that it referred to as a regression analysis some years ago, and it helps you understand this headline social housing indicator, in that they did some very clever maths which shows how things like supported housing, housing for older people, if you're based in London, how all of that can inflate your costs. So I'd commend that to those of you that want to get really anarchy about it. The regulator, what I would say about these metrics is the regulator understands the limitations of these metrics, and it looks at these metrics in the round. It doesn't league table, but it is drawn. And it looks at them as a starting point, not the end. So everything that I said previously about using these metrics, thankfully, the regulator's totally clued in and on the same page as us about it. So they use it to start asking questions about why something's so. They are drawn to outliers, but basically, and most of this won't affect you because you're flying under regulatory radar. They basically, what they're looking for is that story about your VFM, why these metrics are how they are, and they're looking to find that out in the narrative that accompanies your publication of these metrics in the accounts. Those of you that are unlucky enough to get an IDA, you'll go through the same process as a verbal test as part of your IDA. Going forward, this is just a bit of a heads up about the way that VFM's going for those of you that are interested. The regulator is keenly aware how much claims on your cash are being made, particularly around investing in your existing stock. You've only got finite resources. I think they're imagining that, there's been this pressure on the sector for quite some time to develop. Now, I think realistically, there's this expectation that you need to focus on your existing stock. And of course, the first call, thanks to Grenfell and the whole thrust of the white paper, is to get the safety of your properties up to scratch, first of all. They also expect you not to be, if you like, postponing your improvement programs as well. So maintaining the quality of social stock is also a priority. And then just down the road, we've also got the climate change agenda and decent homes too. They know all of this is on your kind of horizon. And so I think increasingly when they have debates with organizations, or what they'll increasingly want to see is some kind of story that the exec and the board understand these demands, these competing demands on finite resources, and they've worked out what needs to be done and how they're going to be allocating cash to it. So in terms of getting your regulatory cost metrics, your regulatory mandatory metrics, the metrics on the previous slide, in terms of getting the definitions right, what you need to know is the regulatory metrics definitions. Every aspect of their definitions are actual components to lines in the electronic accounts, the FVA. So for a lot of you who don't do the FVA, that's no good to you, right? The reason they did that was obviously most of you are flying under their radar and they're mostly concerned with the bigger organizations. So they thought it would be a neat trick to have metrics that were based on actual component lines of the FVA template, because that would be really easy for everyone to do. It's just not easy for you guys to do because you don't do an FVA. But that's the origin of these metrics. So what the regulator has done over the last couple of years is issue something, and again, this is a hypertext link, to help the sector get those metrics right. This is the latest version. They provide full definitions to the metrics, but you'll also find them by clicking on our little blue question mark. And as I said, they map to definition components. each component part of the regulator's definitions map directly to something that is understood and that goes into the FVA template. This should make it completely idiot-proof for the bigger organizations. Yeah, because if you're filling out your FVA, which is a regulatory requirement, you can't help but address each of the component bits of the mandatory financial metrics. And Annex A for the bigger organizations give you an entire mapping document to ensure that you know which lines of the FVA template that you go to get the various component bits of these metrics. There should be no issue about it. You should just be able to get those definitions right. As I say, it doesn't work for the smaller organizations. So that's why, and it was partly to do with us kind of moaning in their ear that this doesn't work for smaller associations. So they came up with Annex B in this document, which is also a mapping guide. And as I'm quoting them here, it's intended to help smaller providers locate the equivalent lines within their stat account and enable them to calculate the VFM metrics. In other words, short answer, go straight to Appendix B. It will help you navigate your own accounts to get the regulatory mandatory metrics correct. They also imagine, because of changes to audit over the last few years and the fact that auditors have to be a bit more rigorous in checking any figures quoted, they imagined that your auditors would be able to assist you and double check basically that you'd got your metrics right. That, folks, is it. And you'll see I've conveniently put James' name there to answer any of the difficult questions, but I'll just have a look, see if there's any further questions that come up. You see, I thought this might have this effect on you, hence me saying put away the sharp objects. I've got no further questions at the moment, so I've overshot once again, but hopefully that was helpful to you all. I'll just give it a second just to see if anything's going to come in. But otherwise, guys, thanks for attending this session. I really hope it's helped. We can't square absolutely everything in this. You know who to get in touch with if you've got any issues. We'll be more than happy to answer any of these. As I say, if necessary, we'll get in touch with HouseMark and we'll corroborate our take on things. We actually welcome calls, questioning about this, because it'll help us, if you like, fine-tune the definitions, and it helps us help you get the data right. So I just really, really encourage you to get in touch with us. Well, Helen's saying it's been dead helpful, so I'm going to extrapolate that across to the other 52 of you, and I think we've probably done all right there. So, right, guys, I know you've got loads and loads of things to do. Let you get back to it. My presentation will be available. This recording will be available. Do push your colleagues who couldn't attend today, push them in the direction of this, because hopefully it will help us nail data quality and improve the credibility of data in the sector, full stop. Thanks, everyone, and see you soon.